Our podcast partner for this session is Launchora.
समझ अपनी भाषा में ही आता है. कंटेंट आपकी भाषा में ओनली ऑन डेली हंट. हमें पता है आपको क्या चाहिए. अपनी पसंद का कंटेंट ओनली ऑन डेली हंट. रखो अपने एरिया की खबर. लोकल अपडेट्स ओनली ऑन डेली हंट.
Welcome back to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival protected by Dettol here at the front lawn at Diggy Palace, Jaipur. It's our pleasure to present A Coup in Turkey, a tale of democracy, despotism and vengeance in a divided land. Jeremy Seal in conversation with Max Rodenbeck. A gripping and multi-layered political narrative, Jeremy Seal's A Coup in Turkey, a tale of democracy, despotism and vengeance in a divided land, unravels the events leading up to the coup that removed the traditionalist Prime Minister Adnan Menderes of Turkey in 1960. Through eyewitness accounts, Seal lays bare the striking parallels between the past and the present and digs deep into the heart of the feud. Seal's other books include The Wreck at Sharpnose Point, Meander East to West, Indirectly, Along the Turkish River, and Affairs of the Heart. Travels around Turkey in search of a hat, among others. In conversation with South Asia Bureau Chief for The Economist, Max Rodenbeck, Seal explores this charismatic political figure and his eventful downfall and dramatically re-enters our understanding of the past. Jeremy Seal is a British travel writer whose major interest is Turkey. His previous books include Affairs of the Heart and Meander. He has written for numerous publications, teaches creative writing, and also leads cultural and archaeological tours in Turkey. Max Rodenbeck is a journalist, critic, and writer on global affairs. Before his current post as South Asia Bureau Chief for The Economist, based in Delhi, he spent 30 years in the Middle East covering wars, revolutions, and hubbly-bubblies from Iran to Morocco. Ladies and gentlemen, A Coup in Turkey, a tale of democracy, despotism, and vengeance in a divided land. Jeremy Seal in conversation with Max Rodenbeck.
Our podcast partner.
Unmuted myself. Sorry. Great pleasure to welcome you all to this session. And it's going to be fun. We've got a wonderful author, Jeremy Seal, who's done yet another wonderful book in a long series. His big subject is Turkey. He has many other interests. But I think we're going to dive in fairly quickly to get things moving. And I'm going to start by asking Jeremy a rude question, which is, this book, I found it fascinating. For me, it opened up lots of things that I was unaware of regarding Turkey. But I wonder if Jeremy would like to say in your own words, what should interest the world in this particular figure, this Adnan Menderes? I mean, he's a prime minister who was the key political figure in Turkey during the 1950s. Died, it's nearly, 60 years ago. Why should we be interested in Adnan Menderes and this Turkish figure from 60 years ago?
Thank you, Max. Very good question. Firstly, before I start, can I just say hello to all of you who I can't see, but I'm very grateful to you all for being here. So thank you, and I hope that we can that our discussion proves fruitful for all of you. In terms of Adnan Menderes, I think maybe a good starting point is to indicate that one of the things I've noticed about Turkey in all my years there is that there's always been a monopoly in terms of the political figures who feature, as it were. And that's because Turkey is home to what is presumably, I would say undoubtedly actually, the biggest personality cult of all, which is Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the great founder of the modern Turkish state, who came to power in 1922, died in 1938, but remains even today the overwhelmingly most important figure, almost to the exclusion of everybody else in terms of the iconography. So you look at the notes, and you look at the banknotes, and you look at the portraits, and you look at the statues, and he is everywhere, which is why, it seems to me, no other political figures actually get a look in. And that is one of the reasons why Adnan Menderes has never featured. But there are other reasons too. And this is because ever since his death in 1961, which we will discuss, he has been suppressed. His memory has been suppressed to the point of complete erasure, at least until the years of our current Turkish leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And what becomes apparent when you look into the story of Adnan Menderes is that he is nothing less, if you like, than the inspiration for Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He is effectively the template. And as I started digging into the story of Menderes, which, as I say, is centered on the 1950s. He comes to power in 1950. He's deposed in 1960. Is absolutely at the heart of this story. So, if you want to understand modern Turkey, it seems to me you absolutely have to understand this figure, not least because he was so rigorously suppressed by the state up until 2000 and the early 2000s when Erdogan came to power.
That's terrific. And Jeremy, if I may, before plunging into the sort of the content of the book, I have another rude question to ask.
I like rude questions. Don't keep the rude questions coming, Max.
Very good, very good. Which is, why should we listen to Jeremy Seal about this? I mean, what is that you can tell? Why you? Why should you be the author of his story?
Let me make my case. I need to go back a little bit to when I left university in 1981. And I didn't know what to do with my life. I had a sort of inkling that I might, in 1984 I left university. I'm adding years to my life. I had an inkling that I might go into writing or into teaching. I did an English language course, teaching English as a foreign language course in London, was offered a job in Ankara, didn't know where Ankara was also offered a job in Stockholm and thought I'd rather go to Ankara than Stockholm. And so I went. So that took me to Turkey in 1984, which was a very interesting time, not least because there had been a coup in 1981 and the country was still laboring under the shadow of that coup. But it was a fascinating time, and it was a country that I instantly fell in love with and have continued to be transfixed by to this day. And I think over the 30 years, if that's what it now is, I can claim to have developed a good knowledge of the country. I began as a travel writer, so I have written for a long time for any number of newspapers and publications on the delights of Turkey, but apolitically, effectively. I was always interested in the beaches and the classical ruins and the culture and the people and the landscape and the sense, I suppose, that Turkey was not only, in the old trope, the bridge between East and West, but it was also at the heart of that other nexus, which was North and South. So East and West, you've got Greece and Persia, Persia and Greece. North and South, you've got Russia and Arabia. So Turkey sits at the heart of these four amazing cultures, and I think is informed by that as much as it's sometimes infected by that. So there is that reason for me making the case that it should be me who tells the story. There's another reason, and that is because the Menderes story has been, as I say, suppressed in Turkey. And while Turks talk about the Menderes story, they know that it's very contentious, and it's never been written in a foreign language before. There is no account of Menderes in any detail beyond the journalism that existed. at the time of his reign. There's not really been a lot in terms of looking back at him, at least until recently, when academics have begun to appreciate the way that Erdogan's using him as his kind of justification for his own approach to politics. And what I think I've done, and what I hope I've done, is acknowledge the fact that what you have in Turkey is two political ideological camps, each with their own position. And these positions, broadly defined, are on the one hand, Western, modernizing and secularist, and on the other hand, nationalist, Turkish and devout Islamic. And those two positions, and the people who adhere to those two positions, take Menderes as a symbol, and they either turn him, according to their polarized position, either into a hero or into a villain. They willingly, it seems to me, exclude the possibility of the man at the heart of all this. And what I've tried to do, partly because I'm an outsider, is to actually humanize Menderes, to get to the bottom of what he was really like, which no doubt was a mixture of all those elements. He can't have been a complete hero. He can't have been a total villain. Of course, he was something more complicated and nuanced than that. And the fact that both of the camps deny that seems to me an opportunity for me to actually say, here's the real man. And in acknowledging the real man, perhaps you can get closer to acknowledging the reality of each other's positions.
I think that was a very brilliant defense of your position. You'd make a wonderful lawyer. Perhaps you should have been a lawyer instead of an author.
Yes, my daughter's doing that, so we'll leave my daughter to become a lawyer.
Well, I'm very convinced. Could you? It might be useful for some of our listeners just to have a very brief, skeletal brief description of Menderes' story in 3 sentences. You've done it in a book, but can you put it into 3 sentences? He came from
I'm going to take a few more than 3.
What did he do? Why did he die?
Okay, I'll make it as brief as I possibly can at the beginning. He's born in 1899. He comes to power. He becomes a politician in 1931, having been a cotton farmer in the southwest of the country. He's born into money. He's of the landed gentry. Becomes a politician in 1931 when Turkey is a single party state with Mustafa Kemal Ataturk as the president. The president dies in 1938. In 1945, the Turkish government decides to come out for democracy, and it's at that point that the single party state gives way to the democratic model. Menderes is one of the founders of the Democrat Party, which is swept to power in 1950 with Menderes as the prime minister. In the course of that decade, all sorts of things happen, not least the increased animosity of the army for Mr. Menderes, and we can go into the reasons for this in a minute, which ends with them deposing him in 1960, taking him to trial along with all the members of his government in 1960, 1961, and it ends in the humiliation and the subsequent execution by hanging, along with 2 of his ministers, of Menderes on an island of Istanbul in September 1961. So that's the story of his life, briefly put.
Great. And it's a tragic story, and it's a story of this extraordinary rise to power and then this absolutely catastrophic fall. So it makes a riveting tale, in fact. But one of the interesting things about your book is the way that you've decided to tell the story. And I thought it's curious that you actually begin the story not in Turkey at all, but at Gatwick Airport, which is when it's not a place I think I associate with great drama.
Yes.
Could you set the scene at Gatwick Airport?
Yes, indeed. In fact, it was Gatwick Airfield at the time. This is 1959.
Excuse me. I'm terribly sorry.
It had barely emerged as a proper airport. And on February the 17th, 1959, our protagonist, Adnan Menderes, is flying into Gatwick along with a delegation of high-ranking government officials to sign the agreement on the independence of Cyprus, which actually is signed 2 days later on the 19th of February 1959. It's a foggy afternoon, and in the course of that foggy afternoon, the pilot loses his way and comes down amongst trees a couple of miles short of the runway at Gatwick Airport. There are 24 people all in on board. Of them, 14 die outright instantly. Several of the others are very badly wounded, and three out of the 24 are able to walk out of the wreckage unaided. One of these is Adnan Menderes, and it happens that a local farmer, whose name is Margaret Bailey, or at least she's the wife of a local farmer, comes across these three men dressed in suits in the south of England, gloaming on a February day, and discovers to her amazement that he is the Prime Minister of Turkey, and in the background she can see this burning wreckage. So it's an extraordinary situation, and its relevance to what happens subsequently is this. Menderes is overthrown 15 months later. This is February 1959. Menderes is overthrown in May of 1960. The important fact is this, that the fact of the crash, which is the first fatal crash suffered by Turkish Airlines, obviously is considered a national tragedy back in Turkey. But more than that, the fact of Menderes' survival is really key to our story, in that the base that he's been developing for himself ever since he came to power was devout, traditional, and increasingly Islamic. And this base sees in his survival the hand of Allah, the hand of God. And this plays out really dramatically 2 weeks later when he gets back to, when he returns to Turkey, a surviving hero, miraculously still alive. And he arrives at Ankara railway station, where he is met by huge crowds of his devout base. And they're all bringing with them livestock to be sacrificed in thanks for the miraculous deliverance of Adnan Menderes. And there are these amazing scenes where the boulevards of Ankara run with blood as oxen and goats and sheep and even camels are brought down in the name of their surviving hero. And it seems to me this is absolutely essential, because this is the moment, I think, although it's unspoken, when the opposition to Menderes recognized just what a threat he means to them, that by weaponizing Islam, he's reached a stage where his believers think he's untouchable. And perhaps that's the prompt that causes the army to begin to think about how they might move against him.
And this sort of display of, the sort of what might say the sort of the primitive side of the religion, sacrifice and blood for your leader, is exactly what, or this sort of primitive sacrifice. Primitive is the right word, but this mass display of fervor is exactly what Ataturk had tried to sort of absolutely extinguish, 40 years before. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
This is the provocation, I think, that everything that Ataturk and his followers have worked for since 1922, and this brings us on to the reform movement, which effectively set out to transform the Ottoman Empire in the form of the modern Turkish state, with the Ottoman Empire being a theocracy run by a sultan, into a modern, very westward, radically Western state, almost overnight. Which, at least in terms of the few years that they tried to do it. So they begin in 1922, and by Ataturk's death in 1938, the country, to all intents and purposes, has been transformed in terms of the script, in terms of the civil code, in terms of the language, in terms of the way people dress, in terms of every aspect of life, and not least the relegation of religion to an entirely private practice, rather than at the heart of the state and the way that the state works. So when the followers of Ataturk, he now being dead in 1938, in 1959, see Menderes come back and not only fail to discourage these scenes of kind of primitive, barbaric superstition, but actually seem to enjoy it. There is this feeling that everything that the Turkish state and the followers of Ataturk have fought for is at risk.
And I think you also, well, we may get back to this later, but you point out an irony that because Menderes survived this plane crash, to his followers, it seemed that he was invincible. So in some ways, in an ironic fashion, when he was overthrown and put on trial, it became almost necessary to execute him just to prove that he was not invincible. So in some ironic way, having surviving the plane crash made him more likely to die by being executed.
It seems to me that it effectively functioned as his death sentence. I think that's entirely right. There were military officers within the junta whose position was, if we don't execute him, they will take it as the fact that we simply couldn't. And we therefore need to demonstrate that what happened in 1959 in that Surrey wood near Gatwick was entirely down to luck rather than to any kind of rather than to any divine intervention. And that's, for me, such an interesting aspect of all this. But it plays into the fact that even late on in the trials, when it appeared that Menderes was heading for execution, that any number of his base were saying they can't do it, they won't be able to do it, they're not going to be able to kill him because it's already been demonstrated that he's untouchable. So he becomes a sort of semi-supernatural figure even before he dies, and then goes on, as we'll talk a bit later, I suspect, to what he becomes subsequently and posthumously.
Right. No, it's fascinating. I'm going to have to back us up a little bit, if we can.
Yeah, please.
If you don't mind. We sort of back up to the point when Ataturk died in 1938, having completed this very radical transformation of Turkey, radical secularization, which cast religion right out of public life in virtually every way possible. And the degree of the radicalism of that revolution, it's hard to sort of even conceive of now. I mean, he just uprooted absolutely hundreds of years of tradition.
Yes.
But then that was 1938, and Menderes actually sort of comes into power in the early 1950s.
Yes.
How did that happen? What was this drift that allowed Menderes, who is not a rabid secularist, how did he sort of manage to come out of that radical secularism and emerge?
Well, I think
majority.
I think it's entirely to do with the role of democracy within the modern Turkish state. Even though Turkey under Ataturk and up until 1945 was a single-party state run by the party that Ataturk had founded, there had always been a slightly suppressed strand, if you like, of sort of reform and a desire for democracy amongst some people, even amongst the late Ottomans. And this was pressing harder and harder, it seems to me, upon the Turkish state, at least certainly in 1945, because what happened after the war, and we now need to very quickly look at the role of Turkey within the war, was that Turkey had not taken sides, to the disgust, actually, of the Allies, had refused to take sides in the war, and in fact had continued to sell chrome, which the Nazis needed to plate their munitions, in large quantities to Germany until late 1944. So there was a lot of animosity towards Turkey amongst the Allies. And what the Turkish state recognized in 1945, having only just come into the war on the side of the Allies rather too late, was that their main enemy that they'd made in all this was the Soviets, who were very belligerent at this point. And of course, the Soviet Union abuts Turkey. And the Soviet Union, the Russian state, has always looked covetously towards Turkey, not least because it represents a warm water route to the Aegean for its Black Sea fleet. So there was this sense that, that they were in danger from the Soviets, and the Soviets made all sorts of belligerent noises. The Turkish state's response to this was to declare unequivocally on the part of democracy and make a case to be accepted in the family of the Western nations. And I think that there were lots of Turkish leaders at the time who felt that Turkey probably wasn't ready for a fully fledged democracy, but that they had no choice. And therefore they needed to go for democracy if they wanted to fend off aggression on the part of the Soviets, who might well have considered invading not least Eastern Turkey, where a couple of the provinces they considered to be their own. So the decision is taken to adopt democracy without any delay. And I suppose it's a natural consequence of that. The moment you do that, you suddenly then discover just how much opposition there was to the radical reform program of Ataturk and his Kemalists, because people are actually allowed to vote upon it. So Menderes finds him as one of the leading figures of an opposition party, which naturally comes to stand for opposition and resistance to what the ruling party stands for, which is hardline secularism.
And he comes riding on this wave of opposition, the first chance that people have to protest. And I think, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that as he comes in, it's sort of a revelation. Also, the extent of the division in Turkish society, largely between rural and urban, or between cosmopolitan big cities, which were pretty much entirely behind the secularization drive, and then this vast sort of country hinterland, which was not and was resistant. But the level of that resistance didn't really become clear until Menderes comes into power.
Exactly. I think the question had never been asked. And there was this deep-seated contempt of the educated elites for the peasant masses, which Menderes not only recognized, but decided to actually do something about. What the educated elites have done in terms of the peasantry, and of course the people who lived in the country in Turkey in the 1950s, the split was about 75%, 25%, 75% farming peasantry, 25% educated townies. And therefore, I mean, it doesn't take a mathematician to work out that if that's the breakdown, and if you then have free elections, whoever represents the peasantry is going to come out on top. And I think that Menderes did this partly because it was the route to power, but also because I believe genuinely that at the beginning he was sincerely supportive of the needs of country people. He had worked, of course, he'd run a large cotton farm of his own of 30,000 acres with a lot of farming people on it in his corner of the country prior to becoming a politician. And I think that he had adopted a sort of a patriarchal and beneficial stance towards farmers. So he was well placed to position himself as a representative of the working people. What also helped him at that point was that 1950 sees the Americans eventually deciding that the Turks are a good thing and that they're going to back them with large amounts of aid fund through the Marshall Plan. So suddenly the Democrats, as they come to power in 1950, discover that they not only have the enthusiasm to do something for their rural base, they actually have the funds to deliver it as well. So what you see in the early 1950s is lots of money being funneled into infrastructure in the countryside, water being piped to the villages, new roads, all the rest. And suddenly the prospects of the ordinary working country people, which up until then had been dire, I mean literally dire, are transformed.
I think as you put it, and it was this often used phrase in Turkey that during the 1950s, it was Menderes who took people out of their cheap sandals and put them into shoes. That's what happened in the decade.
Exactly, and you still hear people using that phrase. I mean, you still come across people all over Turkey now who remember him, and they attach that phrase as their way of defining their reasons for being grateful towards him.
But during this decade, though, there's so many ironies in this story, and in some ways there are ironies that are quite familiar to Indians right now in politics. When Menderes came in, he was Mr. Clean. He was absolutely in favor of free speech and so on. He was in favor of freedoms of every kind. But over the course of the decade, this became less and less true of his rule. He became more and more of a populist sort of despot, actually. I mean, how did that happen? It just seems ironic that by the end of his rule as prime minister, he was not only throwing journalists into jail, but throwing into jail some of the same journalists that he had freed from prison 10 years before.
Yeah, two things to say there. I think one, the parallels with the current president, but also I think what you find is that it seems to me a natural kind of default deterioration. And maybe it's to do with people who are better suited for autocracy and who have come out of a tradition of autocracy, discovering that their skin is not as thick as it needs to be for democratic life. Menderes had a complicated background. He had suffered a lot of trauma in his early life. And I think that he was hypersensitive. He simply, as much as he adored the adoration of the masses, and he was a great one for attending rallies, again like Erdogan, he could not abide criticism. to the point where the only way he could actually deal with leadership was to actually reset it in a non-democratic way. So you get this natural retreat from his espousal of democracy to an absolute denial of it. Exactly.
But it seems. I mean, I'm sure your characterization of Menderes is quite accurate. But it also seems there's something systemic in Turkey, certainly at that time. But it seems to be true now. I mean, Erdogan is almost as prickly, and worried about criticism. But the way that you've described the sort of the political evolution in the 1950s is that democracy became a sort of quite vicious zero-sum game, where the party in power went after its opponents in a truly kind of trying to shut them out completely, and to the point of fisticuffs and clashes in the parliament and so on. I mean,
yeah.
Is there something in Turkey itself that makes politics end up like that? Because it seems to have happened again 30, 40 years later. And
look, I wonder whether it's something to do with the transition, the very dramatic transition from the previous incarnation to the modern one. And I think you get the same thing in Soviet Russia and its transition from the Tsarist state. I mean, there are kind of interesting parallels with Putin as well that you get with Menderes. And I think it is simply to do, and I think it's partly to do with this very interesting fact that actually what they know is that their contempt of democracy, to a degree at least, plays quite well with their base, because their base is effectively looking for another strongman. They're looking for a sultan. Effectively, they're looking for a sultan figure, and they don't want a modern democratic politician who's prepared to make compromises, because it's not their idea of what a leader does. And maybe that's what's going on here.
Yeah. One of I want to talk a bit about how you've written the book, which it was quite wonderful. You've enlivened it immensely. This isn't a typical history book. I mean, it's not you've got the footnotes, you've got lots of research, both literary research, archival research, and interviews with some really interesting people, including sort of bit characters, people who knew Menderes, including prison guards, all kinds of people. I just what sort of category would you put your book into? Is it a history book? Is it a biography? Is it where would you put it? Because in some ways, if you let me go on a little bit, it reminded me a little bit of a sort of television docudrama. You've animated it with conversations that aren't real, but they're very useful, I found. I mean, I thought it didn't annoy me. I found they were actually, you managed to get a lot of information into these conversations, but they're conversations that you've recreated.
Yes.
Can you explain something about that?
Sure, and I wouldn't wish to annoy you, Max. So that's all to the good. Yeah, that's all to the good. I mean, firstly, I should say that I come out of a tradition as a travel writer, so there is a sense in which this book also takes the form of a travelogue. I'm traveling around Turkey. It happens in 2016, researching the story of what happened in the 1950s. So it is a travelogue, but all my travelogues have been rich in history. History is my kind of thing. And this one, as you say, also serves to a degree at least as a biography, a first biography in English of Menderes. So it is all these things. And then, as you say, there's also this kind of degree of dramatization, which is something I go with. I wanted to tell this primarily not as an analysis of this period, but as the story of this period, because some of the detail, for example, of the trial is extraordinary. It's surreal and it's very dramatic. And of course, the execution is dramatic. There were so many elements, it seemed to me, that went into a story rather than anything else. And the reason why there are episodes where I invent the narrative, where I invent the dialogue, is because I know those episodes took place. I knew what the outcome of the episode was, and I can sort of guess at what was said, but nobody will tell me because the actual wording was not actually recorded. So I made the call to actually provide them. And that plays into the idea I was talking earlier about, of how do you humanize a figure who really needs to be humanized when the two versions of it are both polarized and, if you like, nothing more than symbols. So I wanted to find a way of giving a life to a man whose life has effectively been withdrawn by his reduction to either hero or villain status.
And I think you do point out that in Turkey, it's very difficult to be neutral about this. I mean, it remains polarized. I mean, it hasn't stopped.
Exactly.
So the role that you can play to sort of, allow people to talk to each other in a way. But I do hope that you get the Netflix contract.
So do I.
For your serialization, because it is a very dramatic story, I think.
It is a dramatic story. I mean, I'd like the Netflix contract too. So if anybody's talking to Netflix now, please put them in touch.
Yeah. And well, I'm going to open up for questions from the audience in a second, but just before opening up, one thing what is Mendes' legacy right now in Turkey?
Well, it's really interesting because the Erdogan lot are playing him for all they're worth at the moment. The island where he was imprisoned off Istanbul, called Yassıada, where he and all his MPs and ministers were imprisoned for over a year in 1960, 1961, has been reopened as a memorial museum to Menderes and to the Menderes years. So, as I've already indicated, the Erdogan people are playing him for all they're worth as the hero of democracy. But he remains, as far as the opposition is concerned, as the worst thing that ever happened to the country. I've heard people use that phrase in relation to him. These are often people who are a lot younger than me, certainly weren't around when Menderes was around. And I think a lot of what they know about the man is based upon, I would contend, unfair, biased readings of the man. And I think that's what we need. We need to actually bring him back into the center ground so that people get a sense of what he really should represent.
Fantastic. Well, listen, I'm going to open up to the audience. We have some questions that people have sent in, and we have Manya and Emma both asking exactly the same question. I
Yes.
think that they have a future as internet trolls because they've asked the same question with the same words exactly. And the question is, how did the book change you, Jeremy? I.e., what role did the book play in your personal growth and development?
It's a really good question. The reason I wrote this book, given that I'm a travel writer and largely apolitical in my approach to things, was that I reached a stage in about, it was actually 2013 when the Gezi protests took place in Istanbul. You'll all remember them. They were the protests about a park, which caused the country to almost go up in flames for one summer in relation to the resistance to the plans that Erdogan had for this particular park in Istanbul. And it was at that point that I began to get a kind of sense that my understanding of the country had actually naturally taken me to the need to engage with a more contentious and a more difficult subject, which was the political side of things, not least because I saw a lot of writers being imprisoned, and I was actually beginning to receive adverse comments about things I was writing in travel articles. And I thought, this is not reasonable, this is not unfair, this feels like a spur to me to actually look at the bigger question of what are the political underpinnings and the political currents at work in this country. And then I came across the Menderes story quite by chance when I was on a walk in the southwest of Turkey, and I came across an old man in a house who invited us in for tea, and on his wall there were all these pictures of his family, and this particular picture of Menderes with his ministers showing them a model of a mosque. And I had never seen at that point another image of a political figure in Turkey other than Ataturk and indeed Erdogan. And I suddenly realized from that exchange that there was this hidden figure who had a hidden story, who might be able to, and by digging around with that, might be able to inform better my understanding of how the country operates and the forces at work there.
And the parallels between Erdogan and Menderes are really quite extraordinary. I mean, the photograph of the mosque that you describe is exactly the sort of picture of Erdogan that one sees all the time, because he's built mosques all over the place, the world's biggest, and then a bigger one, and then a still bigger one, with the same sort of grandiosity and the idea of recapturing some kind of Turkish greatness. And I mean, there's something else that's similar was both of them were determined to remake Istanbul. I mean, they sort of wanted to make that their particular personal showcase, which I thought I think is kind of fascinating.
The great builder, this was the idea. They both regard themselves as the great builder or the great architect.
Yes.
So infrastructure.
Another question from Amaya, let's see, who asks, given this, do you think rapid progress or shift from what is considered traditional, is a shift from what is traditional plausible without massive backlash in terms of social justice. What does Menderes, the story of Menderes, make you think about the possibility of rapid progress without giving attention to social justice?
It's a really good question. And I think that people who look at the reform years, 1922 to 1938 particularly, they have to acknowledge that the devout majority were treated very badly. And they were forced to come along whether they liked it or not. It wasn't Bolshevik, but there were some fairly unpleasant things done in terms of suppressing those natural post-Ottoman sentiments and attitudes towards life. I agree. I think it's really, really hard to affect the kind of transformation that Ataturk set out to do. I think he's been partially successful, if not more than partially successful, and only because he was so much admired, and in two ways. Admired by everybody as a military figure, as the savior of the nation from invasion, but not admired to the same degree as a social architect and as a social engineer. And that's where the complicated thing arises. Comparable attempts to change were effected in countries like Afghanistan, of course, in the 1930s, and self-evidently did not succeed to the same degree. I think that the really good news is, despite the fact that democracy always seems to be under threat in Turkey, what happened over the last couple of years, where some very important elections were won by the opposition, despite Erdogan's party doing all they could to win them themselves, suggests to me that despite all of this, there is a very strong feeling for the importance of democracy in Turkish life. There is a pride in democracy, and I think it has taken root. So I am hopeful that democracy at least has put down its roots. But it may well be the case that the consequence of the application of that democracy is that the country continues to actually choose a slightly different route to the one that Ataturk chose, which was full-on westernization and modernization. Maybe it's going to be something more nuanced and more complicated.
But it might have to wait for Mr. Erdogan to leave the scene.
Yes, 2023 are the next big elections. Nobody's quite sure what will happen. There is an interesting figure who's the mayor of Istanbul, who actually came to power in Istanbul in 2019 in very dramatic circumstances. Whether he is going to be able to carry a victory in 2023, assuming he stands, nobody's quite sure. But it'll be really interesting. That's the moment, I think.
And I have another question, a question from Amaya, who's asking, what does the aftermath of the coup in Turkey tell us about modern day populism and democratic backsliding? And I just add something that occurred to myself as well, which is that there's a phrase that both Erdogan and Menderes used a lot, which they both talked about the popular will, as if they are the incarnation of the popular will. But at a certain point, their expression of the popular will stops being popular and becomes their own will. And I just what is the point at which that happens? Do you think? And and to get back to Amaya's question, what does that tell us about modern day populism and the likelihood of backsliding democracy?
Well, it's very reductive, isn't it? This kind of notion that whatever happens at the ballot box is the extent of how democracy should be applied. And beyond that, until the next time that people are invited to go to the ballot box, you just put up with what the government wants to apply and put through. It's effectively a kind of majoritarianism. And it seems to me it's a natural reading of democracy if you're the sort of leader who's not very comfortable with it and actually comes from a more authoritarian tradition. It's effectively saying, yeah, we'll sign the box saying democracy, but we won't really deliver on it.
Well, I think Erdogan famously said that democracy is a tram that you get onto, and then you can get off when you want to.
Indeed. That has been leveled against him so many times, and of course, it's incredibly. I think what's most interesting about it was he said that publicly. He was prepared to say that at a point where he actually felt he could get away with it. Broadly speaking, evincing a sort of a contempt for democracy that probably plays, as I've suggested before, reasonably well in the villages, where to a lot of them, the notion of collective decisions runs against their experience of democracy, which is that there will be a village elder to whom you go to, if it's not the imam, to whom you go to for advice on how you live your life, and that's it. What democracy in the broader, more inclusive sense is trying to do is to break down those old structures, which is, I think, going to take a while.
Yeah, yeah. And as I was saying, one worries about, democracy played, regarded as a zero-sum game where the winner takes all, or as a game that keeps playing again and again. And it takes a while to evolve from one into the other, if you are lucky enough to do that evolution. So I would hope that Turkey's reached, sort of crossed that corner now. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, that's my feeling. My feeling, because of what happened, as I say, in 2019, which I reference at the end of the book, struck me as being an amazingly important moment, as did what happened in the coup of 2016. Because the difference between the two stories, of course, is that Menderes' story ends up in a successful coup against him. Erdogan's story hasn't ended, and indeed an attempt to end it in 2016 ended up with it failing because it was a blunderingly, spectacularly unsuccessful attempt at a coup, so much so that some people wonder whether it was a put-up job. But the important thing there was that in 1960 there was a lot of support for the coup by supporters of Ataturk and by the secular elites. By 2016, I don't think that was the case. I think there was a general consensus that even if people wanted to see rid of Erdogan, this was not the way to do it. And therefore that a coup was unacceptable in 2016 in a way that it wasn't in 1960. And that seems to me to be full of kind of hope for Turkey's future.
Right, right. Well, thank you, Jeremy. So Erdogan will stay in power longer than we can stay on air. Unfortunately, we've got to wrap up the session. Our time is up. Thanks so much, Jeremy. That was really, really interesting. I wish we could talk longer. But
it's been a pleasure, Max. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah,
and thank you all for listening.
Recommend everyone to read the book. It's a super book, yeah, and very, very readable. It's not a dense history book. It's a lively and fascinating story and a tragic end. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Jeremy and Max, for a riveting conversation. We enjoyed it so much. All our speaker books are available with our online book partner, Amazon. We thank our celebration partner, Diageo. Thank you all for watching and being a fabulous audience. Do stay logged on and continue to watch all the exciting sessions that have been specially curated for you. We encourage you to support us by contributing. Whatever you choose to contribute will help the cause. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021. Our social media handles are @JaipurLitFest. The festival is protected by Dettol. Hope to see you at the next session.
समझ अपनी भाषा में ही आता है, कंटेंट आपकी भाषा में ओनली ऑन डेली हंट। हमें पता है आपको क्या चाहिए, अपनी पसंद का कंटेंट ओनली ऑन डेली हंट। रखो अपने एरिया की खबर, लोकल अपडेट्स ओनली ऑन डेली हंट।
To all storytellers and story lovers, my name is Laksh Datta. I host and produce the Jaipur Bites podcast, where you can hear many of the amazing sessions from the Jaipur Literature Festival. I also produce a few other podcasts, as you can see right here. English, Hindi, fiction, non-fiction. If you see something you like, maybe you can take a screenshot of this right now. I'll give you a second and tune in later. Find them on your favorite podcast app.